Solve the cubic equation using factoring and the quadratic formula. So here is our question. We have x cubed minus 216 equals 0. So we need a factor either using the sum of cubes or the difference of cubes. Well, if you notice, this is the difference of cubes, so we're going to use this particular formula right here. So before we start, okay, what we need to do is we need to determine, okay, what do we have to cube to get x cubed? And then what do we have to cube to get 216? Okay, so we know that what do we have to cube to get x cubed? We know that that's going to be x. And then we need to determine what do we need to cube to get 216? Well, that is 6. Let's go ahead and check. So if we check on our calculator, we'll be able to determine whether that is true. So if we take 6, multiply that by 6, multiply that by 6 3 times, that gives us 216. So now we know that's the case. Okay, now in step number 2, now we need to know what does A represent. So A represents x, and then B represents 6. Okay, and so since it's the difference of cubes, we're going to use this formula to then factor it. So we know the formula is going to be A minus B times A squared plus AB plus B squared. Now let's go ahead and fill that in. So we know that A represents x. We know that B represents 6. So we have x minus 6. And then we know the value of A is x. So it's going to be x squared plus A, which is x, times B, which is 6, plus B, which is 6 squared. Okay, now remember this is going to be set equal to 0 since we know it's set equal to 0 from the beginning. So now in step number 5, now we're going to write this in factored form. We have x minus 6 times x squared plus 6x plus 36, and that's equal to 0. Okay, so now in the question it's saying that we now used factoring. Now we need to use the quadratic formula. Well, when do we need to use the quadratic formula? Well, in order to do that, we need to use the zero product property. So x minus 6 is going to equal 0, and then we have or x squared plus 6x plus 36 equals 0. Okay, now we know that if we solve for x over here, x is going to equal 6. But over here, we could either complete the square or use the quadratic formula, which is asking us to do to solve for the values of x. So that means that over here, we're going to say that A is equal to 1. We know that B is going to equal 6. And we know that C is going to equal 36. And now we're going to go ahead and plug it into the quadratic formula. So x is going to equal negative B, which is 6 plus or minus B squared. So that's 6 squared minus 4 times A, which is 1, times C, which is 36. And then we're going to divide that by 2 times A, which is 1. So let's go a little further. We have negative 6 plus or minus. Okay, well, let's go ahead and find out what we get here. Well, we know that it's going to be 6 squared. So 6 squared, and then it's going to be minus 4 times 1 times 36, and that gives us negative 108, and then we're going to divide that by 2. Okay, so now we need to simplify this negative square root of negative 108. So let's first figure out what is the prime factorization of 108. Well, the first thing is is that we know that 2 can go into 108, and that is 54 times. We know that 54 is the same thing as 6 times 9. This is 2 times 3, and then this is 3 times 3. So the prime factorization is 2 squared times 3 cubed. So what that means here is that when we want to simplify this, we know that we're going to be simplifying 2 squared times 3 cubed times -1, because that gives us -108. So now let's go ahead and factor out everything that we can factor out. We can factor out a 2 squared times, we can factor out a 3 squared times, we can factor out a -1, the square root of -1, and then what's left over is the square root of 3. The reason why is because we have to have an exponent that can be divisible by 2 since the index is 2. Well, what do we have to square to get 2 squared? Well, the answer is 2. What do we need to square to get 3 squared? The answer is 3. The square root of -1 is I, and then that is the square root of 3, and therefore 2 times 3 is going to be 6i times the square root of 3. So therefore x is going to equal -6 plus or minus 6i times the square root of 3 over 2. And so now we need to simplify this. So we know that we have -6 over 2 plus or minus 6 over 2i times the square root of 3. So therefore x is going to equal -3 plus or minus 3i times the square root of 3. So therefore those are our 3 solutions. So the 3 solutions are 6, and then the 2 solutions is -3 plus or minus 3i times the square root of 3. Let's go ahead and plug that in. So again, we know it's what? 6. And then it is what? -3 plus or minus 3i times the square root of 3. Let's check our answer, and there is our result.